Hi, guys. Welcome to episode number 78 of the For Animals for Earth show. Are zoos ethical? This is a very big discussion, isn't it? I am joined in today's interview by Rob Laidlaw. He is the founder of ZooCheck. That's a wildlife protection organization based in Canada that's been helping animals for 40 years. He is also a chartered biologist. He's an advocate, a speaker, one of the most effective animal rights advocates of the century. And he's very down to earth. And what I think is really cool about Rob, at least from my perspective, is that he seems to really meet things where they are. And in saying that, I mean, in a perfect utopian world, we would all love for no animals to be in captivity, right? We would like to have all animals out in the wild. But the truth is, that's not where we're at right now. There are many animals in captivity in zoos, and he really focuses on looking at the reality of what exists right now and what we can actually push and change to make better within the constraints of where we are right now. So I think that's really cool, and I honestly think that's a lot of why he's so effective. um, we are so blessed today that he was willing to come and sit with us and share his ideas and let me pick his brain on this question. Because if you're here, you are probably like me, where you question often, are zoos ethical? My default has always been that the answer is no. However, I can't really sit in a conversation and knowledgeably have any good reasons for why I feel that way. And I think it's because it's very nuanced and there isn't really a clear yes or no. And there are thousands of zoos and many different types. And that really plays into this question of, are zoos ethical, right? So, in today's discussion, we are going to dive into some different pieces. And it's a very kind of wide, comprehensive discussion. It touches on a lot of different things. And so I hope that you'll walk away feeling like more empowered to talk about this with the people around you and to make your own decisions about visiting zoos and how to help animals if you do find that you think animals are in need. So in the conversation, we start with a history of zoos and some of the evolution, and then we're going to talk about what different types of zoos are. We'll talk about some of the design tricks that zoos use to make things look a little better than they are, as well as where captive animals come from in today's day and age. We talk about the impact of captivity on animals and get into a little bit of that, of like what are the psychological and physical impacts on those animals. We'll talk about then some of the things that are often pieces that zoos market to do well, and that is that they're captive breeding to prevent extinction, also about education and conservation within zoos. And then we'll talk about, like, if we could paint our utopian world, what are some opportunities for zoos in the future? So the simple idea from today's episode is twofold. Number one is, don't visit roadside zoos. And Rob is going to talk about what the different kinds of zoos are, but he encourages us to just not visit roadside zoos, not have wildlife come to our home, or like not hire businesses to bring wildlife to our home or to have them at a party. Don't swim with dolphins. He mentions don't walk with wolves, don't hold wild animals for selfies, and don't do cub petting. These are all things that because we are in such intimate contact with wildlife, are most likely abusive. So he just encourages us to just stay away from it and instead only view animals in a professional facility where we're not intrusive and we're actually respectful and compassionate when we're viewing them. And then if we do choose to visit a zoo, he encourages us to do a little bit of research ahead of time. Look up some of the animals that we're going to see and get to know what life is like in the wild for them. And then while we're in the zoo, do some comparisons. Like, what do we see about how what we've read about them in the wild jives with what we're seeing at the zoo? And then if we're concerned about something, say something. And in the interview, Rob gives us lots of ideas of who to reach out to. So for the interview, in a video or audio form, as well as a detailed blog post. If you want to follow up on anything that you've heard today, you can get all of that in the show notes, links to Rob, everything at foranimalsforearth.com/show/78. Okay, let's dive in. I think any conversation about zoos and aquariums, it's really important in that conversation to talk about the myriad of different kinds of those that exist. Can you explain the different types of zoos that exist and how those have developed over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people, when they think of zoo, they have a particular kind of institution in mind, but actually, there's a great deal of diversity when you look at zoos and other types of facilities that keep wildlife in captivity. Around the world, there's estimated, because nobody's done an actual physical count of them, but there's estimated to be about 10 to 12,000 zoos in the world. And with that number, of course, you're going to encounter a great deal of diversity. Every aspect of these zoos can change from one institution to another. Here in North America, I tend to lump zoos into certain categories. We have traditional zoos, which are the kinds of zoos that are sort of menagerie style zoos based on an old model, and you find them in towns and cities across Canada and the United States. Sort of what everybody thinks of when they think of a zoo. And the bigger sort of traditional zoos would be the San Diego Zoo or the Bronx Zoo or the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle. And I'd probably lump safari parks in there because most people are familiar with the drive-through safari parks, sort of the lion country safari that used to exist in Florida, African lion safari up here in Ontario. People are familiar with that. So that would be the first category, traditional zoos and safari parks. And then there's another big category of zoos which far outnumber, at least numerically, the numbers of these traditional zoos, and that is roadside zoos and animal menageries. And I would throw in reptile zoos with the roadside zoos as well, because most of them sort of the genesis of those types of businesses tend to be somewhat similar to the roadside zoos and menageries. And then, of course, you have aquariums and marine parks, which I guess would also be traditional in that they've been part of the broader zoo industry for a long time, but they do have a little bit of a different background of development. So just to give your listeners an idea of how zoos developed, we'll do like a super brief synopsis of modern zoos, how they developed. So the first sort of modern zoo opened in Vienna, Austria in 1752, established primarily for scientific purposes, but there was some public visitation. The first sort of quintessential public zoo was the London Zoo in 1828. It was also uh, claiming it was involved and wanted to pursue scientific objectives, but it was also a facility that was open to the public and became very famous. Jumbo the elephant was actually part of the London Zoo for a while, and a number of other famous animals. In North America and Europe, zoos spread. After the London Zoo, they spread throughout many cities in Europe and then to North America. So, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Toronto all had zoos in the 1880s, 1890s. So, it had spread to the North American continent, and things were pretty much the same as the old Vienna model. Modest differences, but sort of the first sort of innovative side to zoo design occurred with a guy named Carl Hagenbeck, which he was an old exotics animal dealer. He did shows. He actually did human shows where he took people of different ethnicities and cultures around, and he did these human shows, just like people would do mobile zoos today. Well, he had a zoo himself called the Tierpark Hagenbeck in Germany, and in 1907, he opened it up, and it was different in that it used these big panoramas behind the animals. So the panoramas, backdrops, some of them painted, some of them that were uh, structural, mostly, that provided this backdrop for the animals, and he used moats in front. So people for the first time could go to a zoo and look across a moat, and without having the view impeded by bars or netting or other types of materials, they could look across a moat and see the animals. So that was sort of the first big innovation, and obviously moats became very popular. In North America, it took a while for them to come here. The biggest sort of development in North America that was next was the opening of Marine Studios in Florida. That was in 1938. It was the first dolphinarium in Florida. So that has certainly in terms of North American history, a long history going back to
Mhm.
1938. And
Mhm.
then more dolphinariums as people saw that they were popular, they were great entertainment, or that's what they were seen as. There were more of them created in the 1950s, and they've spread around the world, of course. In the 50s and 60s, you had a lot of towns and cities that had these menagerie style zoos, and there was something that's been labeled sanitary modernism, in that a lot of the animals looked like they were in bathroom stalls with tiles and with hard floors and all that, and a few objects in there, and it was primarily a disease control mechanism. But that was sort of like putting animals into these very stark types of environments, and those were very common. Luckily, there aren't too many of those 50 style zoos around. And then there were just a few more innovations. Environmentalism in 1979. David Hancock created the first natural exhibit for gorillas at the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle. And that sort of was the start of environmentalism, also called naturalism in zoos. And today there's a lot of zoos that use tricks to make themselves look natural, but they're not really natural, so they don't really follow what David Hancock had established. But there was this sort of revolution when the Woodland Park Zoo opened their natural gorilla exhibit. People all over the world said you shouldn't do it. It's terrible. The animals are going to die. They're going to fall out of trees and hurt themselves and all that. But they went ahead anyways, and it worked out. And now, to one extent or another, that environmentalism or naturalism model is replicated all over the world. A little after that, the rock revolution, and that was when the use of a spray on concrete that can be sculpted relatively easy became ubiquitous in zoos. And you can go to zoos today where you look everywhere and there's this fake rock all over the place. And I call them Flintstone zoos because they remind me of the Flintstones cartoon. And there are good and bad aspects to all this gunite there. I think it's unnecessary. It's expensive. And to me, these zoos look more like movie sets than they do anything for animals. There was the introduction in the United States and Japan in aquariums of giant acrylic panels, where people had these huge vistas, underwater vistas, because of these acrylic panels. That was a big change. And then the other big change, then the final one I'll mention, and there's lots of little aspects to what happened that I'm not mentioning, of course. But it was night zoos in the 1990s. The Singapore Night Safari was established, and that was the first zoo where they had special lighting and all that. You would go and look at the animals at night. To me, I think it's a terrible idea. Probably good for revenue generation, because not only will people come to look at animals during the daytime, they can also come at night. And many that come during the day will come at night. So, you get more revenue. And there's a few of those. And a lot of people talk about the evolution of zoos. Like, okay, we had zoos in ancient times, the Aztecs, the Chinese emperors, and in the Egypt and all these places there were zoos. The
Mhm.
Romans had zoos. There were lots of cultures and civilizations that had zoos. And that, the Vienna Zoo happened and all this other stuff I talked about, and they were primitive, and then they got better and better and better, and now they're the best they've ever been. I don't think so. I don't agree with that. I will obviously admit that there's been some huge improvements in
Mhm.
some aspects of animal husbandry. There have been improvements in veterinary medicine. There have been a number of improvements, but I think the fundamental issues that many animals face have been dressed up or hidden, and we'll get into that,
Mhm.
I hope, in a few minutes. But that the fact that animals are in cages, they're understimulated, their spaces are orders of magnitude smaller than they experience in the wild, and there's lots of animals in zoos, even the so-called better zoos,
Mhm.
that shouldn't be there. I think many of the fundamental problems that zoos had in the past still exist today. So I don't think it's an evolution towards something that's best.
Mhm.
But it is an evolution of sorts. But I think the zoo industry has to go another way. and we can talk about that later. I think
Mhm.
sanctuaries, many of them, show what the possibilities are for wildlife in captivity in the future. They're very different than most zoos are today.
Mhm.
And I will just finish by saying that there is a lot of discussion, certainly in the academic zoo literature, not so much in the popular literature, but there is a lot of discussion about where zoos go in the future, especially when you consider that certainly in North America and Europe, a lot of people here in Canada, it's a majority of people in showing polls to have some level of discomfort with wildlife in captivity. So I think that, and also just all of this new knowledge and different perspectives and younger people coming in,
Mhm.
uh, that there is a burgeoning discussion about what are zoos, how should they be, where should we go in the future, and I think that's very healthy. And of course, groups like mine and others who are articulating concerns and pointing things
Mhm.
out, I think serve a very valuable function in helping to push change, reform, a new paradigm, whatever you want to call it. So that's a little bit about the development of zoos. You can see there are a number of stages. Most people probably, some of them resonate because they've been to these places and they see the big acrylic panels or the drive-through safari parks or the dolphinarium. But that's sort of my take on how they've developed here in North America. And I guess we'll see what the future holds in terms of that development.
Mhm. Yeah, that's helpful. And you mentioned roadside zoos, which I think that would be
Yes,
like what is shown in like the Tiger King series. And there's also
yes.
these traveling mobile zoos and just different other commercial wildlife exhibits all around North America. How do those differ from these more traditional urban zoos that you were describing that we may be more used to seeing?
Yeah, there are profound differences, and for a few of them, there might be some areas of overlap, but it tends to be the exception rather than the rule. So for roadside zoos, and that's why my organization got started here in Ontario, we used to have a very large number of them. We have only the residue of what used to be here 30 years ago still here today, but there's still a problem, and there's certainly a problem throughout the United States and some other parts of Canada. And they are different than professional zoos. I know some people say accredited zoos and non-accredited zoos. I don't use that distinction because I think there are many non-accredited zoos that are better than the accredited zoos. So I just, for the purposes of discussion, refer to sort of the city zoos and the ones that have budgets and all that as professional zoos. They have staff, they have resources, they have all those things that you would expect a big operation like a zoo, even a small one, would require. Roadside zoos, certainly the many other reptile zoos, the traveling mobile zoos, and pseudo sanctuaries. There's a lot of roadside zoos that have tried to rebrand themselves as rescue centers or sanctuaries.
Mhm.
That's very common. And in fact, that was a very specific initiative here in Ontario a number of years ago. In the mid 1990s, where a bunch of the roadside zoos said, "Hey, we're looking bad, let's change and call ourselves rescue centers or sanctuaries." So they continued, but they just changed their name, trying to rebrand themselves. So I would include these pseudo sanctuaries and rescue centers as well in the mix. But what differences they have? One of them that is foundational. It's that they're amateurs and they've often been hobbyists or collectors who
Mhm.
have enjoyed having these animals as pets, and that enjoyment, that interest in the animals and in having them has become larger than it was initially. So they have accumulated more and more animals, and eventually they end up opening a zoo. And some of them think it's a good business. Some of them just want to do it because it's something they've always wanted to do. And occasionally you get people like on the Matt Damon movie who buy a zoo. We had a couple here in Ontario that had no zoo experience, and I don't know if they saw the Matt Damon movie, but a zoo came up for sale and they bought it. But a lot of times it's amateurs that have no formal education, no professional training or mentoring, certainly no professional experience in incredible institutions, whether they're, zoos or others. They often have no professional affiliations or credentials personally, or if they're a business, zoo business, they won't have them even years into their operations. They won't have those things. They will have very limited space. They will have limited resources, and most importantly, very limited finances. So the roadside zoos tend to operate on shoestring budgets. Everything's built on the cheap. So you have cages that are not properly designed, that are built out of, timber and deer fencing, and you get all these different aspects of roadside zoos. You see it time and time again. They're built as cheaply as possible. And then when you look further, you look at, do they have professional staff? No, they'll use family, they'll use friends, they'll use volunteers. Everything's on the cheap. Some of them will feed garbage food, restaurant waste, expired supermarket items and all that to animals to save money. So everything's done on the cheap. In roadside zoos and pseudo sanctuaries, and that the cages are rudimentary, undersized, and they're not designed with the species specific requirements of the animals in mind. They're basically what we call cookie cutter. So you get a bunch of square cages, and you've got a tropical monkey, you've got a peccary from the American Southwest, you've got a capybara from Brazil, and they're all in the same kinds of cages. So that's very common. And of course, there are other things. There's too numerous to mention, but I will just mention high mortalities. There's often a lot of deaths, and a lot of exploitation of animals for commercial gain because the roadside zoos have smaller numbers of people coming in there. They don't have the big budgets, so they will often be doing animal shows, animal presentations. You can take a selfie with an animal. They'll take them off site. And if you ever see that, just get out of there. Any of those activities are bad. That's not what professional zoos and certainly sanctuaries don't do that. So those are some of the aspects of roadside zoos, and it is a profound difference in terms of professionalism, which isn't an endorsement of the professional zoos, because like
Mhm.
I said, they have their problems, but there is a sharp contrast. And I think a lot of the professional zoos feel that the roadside zoos and the pseudo sanctuaries just make them look bad as well.
Mhm. 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 You mentioned that you feel like the evolution of zoos, that zoos have evolved over time, but modern zoos aren't necessarily better than older zoos in a lot of ways. What are some of the different design tricks that zoos will do to make things look better or appear better than they may actually be?
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize, but in most zoos, not so much in the roadside zoos, because in the roadside zoos and the pseudo sanctuaries, what you see is what you get. You see the
Mm,
animal's living space, you see the box it goes in at night, or the barn or the shed. But at other zoos, there is a lot of smoke and mirrors. There's attempts to sanitize the view that the visitor has when they're looking at animals. And I'll go through just a few examples. There's actually, I could list probably 100 things that zoos do, from, when you enter the zoo, how the pathways are constructed, how barriers are constructed, all these things. But I'll just mention a few to give your listeners an idea so that next time they go to a zoo, if they choose to
mhm,
do that, they
mhm,
can think about some of these things. So one of them that's very, very common, and this is one of the reasons the San Diego Zoo became very famous. And, they have a big marketing department, of course, but one of the things that helped them is that they live in a warm environment and they had lush vegetation throughout the zoo. And I went there about 10 years ago. For some reason, I hadn't visited it in all the years I'd been doing this work, but I finally did visit the San Diego Zoo. And I could see how lush the greenery was in the zoo. And when you walk through and you're not critically thinking about the zoo, or you're not paying attention to all the details, it does look like you're walking through this beautiful green environment.
mhm,
And if you're the human walking through it, you are. But for the animals, it's staging. So what they do very well is framing of the animals, so that when you're standing there at the visitor viewing station, let's say you're looking at a tiger or another animal, well, they will have a buffer of green plants separating the walkway from the barrier. And then you look over the moat, and then there would be trees with greenery on the side, and then there would be a backdrop of trees, and then they might have planters with vegetation coming down over the gunite that's surrounding the animal. So when you look at that animal, it's framed in green. Now the animal has no ability to access any of that green. It's biologically irrelevant to the animal. But when you look and you're a casual visitor, it looks like this animal in this beautiful green setting. And that's called framing, and that's very popular. And I think that's one of the reasons San Diego Zoo became, hey, this great zoo, it's beautiful and all that. Another thing that they use that everybody's probably seen are moats. When you're looking across the moat, you see the animal on the grass or on some type of gunite structure or something else, and it looks very nice. But if you're looking from the animal's perspective back, you may see all the infrastructure and everything. So the moat itself, it's a very let's say legitimate kind of area to use. I think there are advantages to using moats over other kinds of things. There are also
Mhm.
disadvantages, but when you're looking back from the animal's perspective, you generally are not seeing anything natural. It can be very, very different.
Huh.
So, that's a way of making it look better to the visitors. And in front of the moats, they have nice that green buffer that I talked about.
Mhm.
A lot of zoos, you see that here in Toronto at the Toronto Zoo with the gorillas. And I actually have visited zoos with a colleague of mine who knows a lot about zoos, and he's been tricked a few times. At the Toronto Zoo, he was looking at the gorillas and he thought, well, I've seen better, but it's not too terrible. But what he didn't notice until I brought it to his attention was that all of the vegetation on the indoor part of the gorilla exhibit wasn't accessible to the gorillas. And in fact, they were all hot wired. So the gorillas would get a shock if they tried to use it. And the hot wires had been shaped into the shape of bushes. So the casual visitor coming along would see these brownish bushes and not think anything of it. But in fact, those are wires that have an electric current going through them. It's not going to seriously injure a gorilla or kill a gorilla or anything like that, but it's going to stop the gorilla from going and ripping apart that vegetation, which it would probably love to do. So there are things like that where you have inaccessible resources that are sectioned off from animals through these tricky means. I've seen it done with lemurs, stopping lemurs climbing trees, and they have hot wires that are stimulate vines that they wrap around the trees and things like that. And most people would never realize that. They'd think, oh, look, there's that vegetation. It's great.
Right.
And not realize that the animals can't access it. I'll just give you a couple more. If
Yeah.
you go into
Wow.
aquariums, you look
Mhm.
in a lot of aquariums, they put mirrors on the sides of the tank. So when you view, you think the tank is much bigger than it actually is because you're seeing the reflection of the interior of the tank in the mirror. And it tricks, I would say, probably the majority of people. Uh, and I'll give you one final example, and you sort of get the idea. There's all kinds of design things that can be done to make things look better than they are or look different than they are. And the final one I'll mention is that they can actually restrict your viewing to certain types of areas of a cage or certain areas where animals come to. One example was at the Assiniboine Park in Winnipeg, Canada. They opened up this $80 million exhibit called Journey to Churchill, and part of it was polar bears. And they had viewing stations where the public could view through these gunite walls. They had panels of glass where you could view, but you could tell the design was very careful to put the exhibit in the best light possible, so you couldn't view things that they didn't want you to see. So a lot of times, it's controlling what can be viewed, how it can be viewed. It may be these tricks like electric wires. It may be murals at the back. There's all kinds of things. There's whole books written about this. So when people are looking, if you know what to look for, you'll see these things. If you don't, you never will. And that's what most zoos count on. And it's not like it's not like they're evil people trying to be entirely disingenuous. This is just part of displaying animals to the public.
Hmm.
I don't think it's good, but it's sort of just the normal thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Why do you think that zoos and aquariums continue to be popular, even though more and more information comes out? They continue to be popular.
Well, they've got a head start. I mentioned the, Marine Studios in Florida started in 1938, that there were zoos here, in North America and Cincinnati and all these places in the 1880s.
Mhm.
And they've got a head start. There were people right from the get-go, back in the 1880s that didn't like them and said they shouldn't be here and all that. But it was basically people that wanted zoos, and many of them in governments that saw them as going to be a benefit to their communities, that were basically taking this steamroller and pushing the zoos into our consciousness and into our towns and cities. So they had a real head start before there was any real serious opposition to what they were doing. And I think the more serious part of that opposition, uh, certainly in the professional NGO sector, started probably about 25 years ago. So it's very recent. So they had a big head start. Like I said, I think that they're viewed as valuable cultural institutions for towns and cities. When you're sitting around at a council chamber or an economic development meeting in a municipality or a region, oh, what do we need? How about a museum? How about an amusement park? How about a zoo? Like a zoo is always in the mix,
Mhm.
and it's something that I don't think should be, but it always is. And that's why there have been so many towns and cities all across North America that had zoos of one kind or another. Even very small communities would want small zoos. So I think the fact that it was seen as a beneficial and cultural institution that could help the community was a big factor. And then the last thing is that, unfortunately, it's normal. Zoos and wildlife in captivity have been normalized. People don't think, oh, we've got an elephant down the street at the zoo, or we've got an aardvark over at this zoo, or we've got a polar bear. That's entirely normal because they've grown up with it. It's in children's books, it's in adult books, it's in popular media. You get all the fluff stories about the animals being born at the zoo and naming contests and all this. It's normal. And that's unfortunate for the animals, because whether you support the idea of zoos or not, I think it would be much healthier for everybody involved, when you're looking from sort of the broader ethical perspective for animals and all of that.
Mhm.
I think it would be beneficial if people said, okay, we want a zoo, but let's do it right because it's not normal. Like,
Mhm.
to me, having an elephant in Edmonton like Lucy
Mhm.
is the most abnormal thing in the world. It is
Mhm.
not normal. Having polar bears in Seattle is not normal, or in San Diego. That is not normal. And that's how we should be looking at it. And if we want a zoo, we should make sure that if those animals are there, there's a darn good reason for it. And if not, then, and we still want a zoo, well, maybe we should look at a different kind of zoo. Maybe we should look at only having animals that are in this region. Maybe we should look at other things. But I think so the head start they've got, the fact that they're viewed as valuable cultural institutions, and the fact that the whole thing is just normal now,
Mhm.
those are probably the biggest reasons for the state of affairs as it exists today. But
Mhm.
it is changing slowly, slowly.
Mhm. Mhm. Where do the animals in these zoos and aquariums come from in today's modern day and age?
Well, like I said earlier, there's 10 to 12,000 zoos, and there's probably a lot of different sources. But for
Okay.
North American zoos, you generally would have three sources. You would have captive breeding, and a significant number of mammals, certainly in better zoos, and I use quotation marks when I say better, uh, would be captive bred. And there's a lot of trade amongst facilities. Some of it's controlled by committees that are focused on the maintenance of genetically viable captive
Okay.
populations of species in captivity. So species survival plans and things like that, and they will dictate, oh, this gorilla should go here and this animal should go here, and generally that's adhered to. But there is a lot of trade amongst other animals as well, amongst zoos, including roadside zoos. There's a very, very significant trade amongst roadside zoos. And that extends to pseudo sanctuaries and reptile facilities and private pet keepers and all that. So there's a lot of captive breeding of animals. There's a lot of animals still sourced from the wild. And if you read most zoo books, they downplay or ignore that. But there are significant numbers of animals, particularly in the aquarium trade. Very large numbers of fish and invertebrates that come from ocean environments are extracted from the ocean. And in the old days, most aquariums would have contractors, or they themselves would go out and catch animals, sometimes on an annual basis. And that still goes on. And I would say that sourcing animals from the wild and captive breeding would generally be the bulk of the animals in North American zoos. And then I have a term that I call it opportunistic acquisitions. We still see this bleed of animals coming from the wild going to zoos. And often it's when, let's say, a state fish and wildlife agency has a grizzly bear cub and they don't know what to do with it. And they know that probably the most humane thing would be to either rehab it and let the animal take its chances in the wild or
Mhm.
euthanize it, but they choose to send it to a zoo because at least it's surviving and they can say they did a good thing. The zoo capitalizes on the receipt of that cub by saying, we're helping the government, we're saving this bear, and this is a rescue. I think the whole thing stinks, but there are a lot of animals that are brought in that way, many of which potentially had other options. And one of the things that my organization has fought for a number of years has been this exact scenario happening with polar bear cubs out of Churchill, Manitoba, where cubs have been brought down to the Winnipeg Zoo. And they actually have something called the Leatherdale Conservation Center, where they say they are rehabilitating these animals for life in captivity. That seems to me to be completely the opposite of the purpose of rehabilitation. You want to
Mm.
rehabilitate them back to the wild, but
Mhm.
they've sort of tilted that or flipped that on its head. But that to me is opportunistic acquisition,
Mm.
and that would be another source. Like I said, not nearly the numbers that are captive bred or that are sourced from the wild, depending on what type of animal they are. But
Mhm.
but it happens. We hear about it on a regular basis,
Oh,
and I think it's for many of those animals, it's unfortunate. For a very few, maybe it's okay, but
yeah.
for many of them, I think they're getting a raw deal.
When you start to think of the life of this animal that has now moved into captivity, what are some of the negative impacts that are truly captivity related, that their life is now in captivity? What are some of those negative impacts on their lives?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, and people, just general members of the public, that are not well versed in biology or
Mhm.
zoology or
Yeah.
that unless they're sort of keeners in terms of doing their own research and learning and all that. Um, it's the effects of captivity are something that a lot of people don't see. Probably the one that people do see the most, and it does disturb most people, are what are called stereotypies or stereotypic behaviors, which are basically when you see, the bears pacing back and forth, or the lion pacing in figure eights, or the elephant rocking back and forth, those meaningless, repetitive
Mhm.
movements that may have had some type of reason, some stimulus that caused that in the beginning, but it's now sort of this just repetitive behavior that is inherent in that animal, very, very hard to get rid of. So people see that and they can see, okay, that's not good. That animal shouldn't be pacing like that, and I don't like it.
Mm.
That's one manifestation of the psychological and social problems that animals experience in captivity. So um, I guess the way to look at that whole suite of things is to realize that animals like us have negative emotional states, and that these states may be prominent in the lives of many animals in captivity. Primary amongst them would be boredom.
Okay.
That most animals are in spaces that are orders of magnitude smaller than they would experience in the wild, and that are not even 1,000th as complex as they would experience in the wild. So it's a real challenge for them to be mentally occupied. So
Mhm.
they get bored. And
Mhm.
you see this is ubiquitous in the zoo world, bored animals.
Mhm.
And some animals fare better than other. Boredom is a huge issue, but so is frustration because they're not able to express normal movements and behaviors. They may be things that those animals desire, or they may be things that they're driven to by instinct, but they can't do those things. So you get frustration, you get anxiety, you may get fear.
Mhm.
There's all these negative emotional states that animals can feel, and that can lead to hyperaggression, hypersexuality, possibly stereotypies, lethargy, all these different things. So some of them are a little easier to see, like the stereotypies. Others
Mhm.
require some prior knowledge or time to be able to witness. So you get these psychological problems, and then you get obviously physical problems because, an elephant can't walk miles and miles and miles a day over varied terrain. A polar bear that may live in tens of thousands of square kilometers of pack ice and coastal environment, is relegated to this very tiny space, millions of times smaller than it would experience in the wild. So you would get diminishment of physical fitness, cardiovascular health, musculature. That's partially why polar bears end up being pear-shaped. They don't look like the animals in the wild. But one of the commonest things that you see from this inability to do what they're supposed to do is obesity, a
Mhm.
massive epidemic of obesity in zoo animals. And I've actually seen, not in the professional zoos, although you do see, uh, legions of obese animals, professional zoos as well. But I've actually seen in roadside zoos animals that were so obese that their stomachs, cougars and other big cats, where the stomachs were touching the ground when they were standing on all fours. So you have a whole range of things. Just to mention a few others, you can have tooth problems from having an improper diet, like the turning of elephant teeth. You can have metabolic bone disease because of vitamin deficiency in reptiles and other animals. You can have foot and joint problems from animals standing, like giraffes standing on hard surfaces. So there's all kinds of physical issues as well as the psychological issues. And then, of course, that leads in many species to premature mortality. So the animals,
Mhm.
even though they're supposedly protected and being given food and all this, they're not living
Mhm.
into the upper reaches of their normal lifespans. They're dying early. And I think orcas and elephants are good examples of that. So what do they experience in the wild that's detrimental? I would say a lot.
Mhm. In captivity. They experience in
Yes,
captivity
sorry,
that's
in captivity,
detrimental.
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes.
I know there's a big movement around environmental enrichment for animals that are in captivity. Do you think that that is making it an acceptable thing?
I look at environmental enrichment in a different way because you often see the value of environmental enrichment, which includes all forms of enrichment, so behavioral and social enrichment and all that as well. But you see it touted as sort of a panacea that, hey, we are doing this enrichment program. We are doing, introducing these objects, doing these things that are making the lives of the animals better. People that go to professional zoos may see the high brows uh, provided for giraffes. So the giraffes can reach up and pluck things out of a ball of hay. They may see touch screens for orangutans and other. So there's a variety of things that people may see. But to me, I look at it a little bit differently because when you look at natural environments, naturalistic environments, and there are many examples out there, they provide the space and complexity that that make them inherently enriched. They do not require any artificial enrichment. If you add it, maybe it's a little bit of a bonus. It's like icing on the cake, but they don't require it. I know people who run bear sanctuaries, the elephant sanctuary in Tennessee. There are the wildlife SOS sanctuaries in India. They're providing large, complex spaces. So they're not deficient in terms of enrichment. I think enrichment, while it can be a valuable tool and should be used, I'm not saying don't don't do enrichment because I think it can have value to animals. It can alleviate the boredom that they're suffering, but it won't do it in the way that providing natural spacious environments will. They are inherently enriched. If you need to enrich an environment, I think it's an acknowledgement of some deficiency in that environment. And I think that's a healthy way to look at it and to see enrichment simply as a tool that will mitigate to some extent, certainly not 100%, it may be 10%, maybe if you know, depending on the animal, it could be 30, 40%. Maybe if you're really lucky, it could be more. But it to me seem like an acknowledgement if you need to artificially enrich an environment that the environment is deficient. And that should inform how you move forward with that animal and its future. So make a long answer short, enrichment is good, but it's got limits.
Mm-hmm. As an average person looking at an animal in captivity, is there any way for us to know if that animal is okay or if the conditions that they're living in are acceptable?
It's very difficult. Obviously, if you go to a roadside zoo or one of these pseudo sanctuaries or whatever, where, like I said before, what you see is what you get. You've got a box, all the animals are in the same things. It's pretty barren. There's the sleeping box. You can pretty much see that that's not very good. And I don't think you need a PhD in zoology. You don't need to be a vet. You don't even really need to know much. You just need to be you know, compassionate and empathetic to animals to say
Mm-hmm.
that's not very good.
Mm-hmm.
In some of the professional zoos, it's a little bit different. I talked about some of the design tricks. Things may look better than they are, but I think for anybody who goes to a zoo that looks carefully, that doesn't just observe casually, but really looks around and says, that animal, that wolf, I know they run through the forest for miles. Is this good enough? Is this complex enough? I think if there's a certain process of thinking, and maybe it's spurred on by a little bit of research before you go to the zoo. You're going to see wolves or an elephant or a bear. Do a little bit of research. It could be on Wikipedia. It's that simple. And just see, what does that animal do? I think then you can look and you can see some of the nuances of the design, the management, the care, the life of that animal, and make a determination. Often it's that the space is too small and it's too barren, and animals are just bored to death, even some of the professional zoos. So, there are ways, but as you move away from those more simplistic environments, or when you move into the area of animals that most people don't understand, like reptiles,
Mm-hmm.
it's a challenge. So, I would just say, generally speaking, if you think something's wrong, if it creates discomfort, it probably is.
Is there, if someone does feel that, do you have advice on, okay, something does seem like it's wrong? Um, any advice on that? What to do?
Yeah, yeah. The worst thing to do is just to keep it to yourself,
Okay.
because then you're removing yourself from any responsibility, personal responsibility or ethical responsibility for trying to help that animal,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that animal may be. So I would say that at the least, if you have something you're concerned about, uh, make a complaint to the zoo, make a complaint to your local legislators, particularly if it's a city facility, make a complaint to regional authorities. Maybe it's Fish and Wildlife that oversees zoos in the state or that particular animal. So I would say look for opportunities, and it doesn't take a long time. It could take you 20 minutes online to figure out, but start to let some people know, let them know what your concerns are. And if you get responses back that you think are sort of formulaic or they're pat responses just meant to get rid of you, then ask some more questions. Don't let it go. And that to me is, I think, something that reasonably almost anybody can do.
Mm,
Obviously, there are people that want to, they might be outraged and they want to make it their crusade for them. That's great. There may be people that want to do other things, but at the least, don't just let those concerns or your feelings just reside in you.
mhm,
Expand the conversation and put them out there. And then if you don't want to go any further, that's fine, but at least you've done that. And
mm,
every person can do that. And I just should add, you can also do that through a letter to the editor. To a
mm,
local paper as well. And then a lot of people will see it. Maybe other like-minded people share your feelings. So I would say
mhm.
just at the very least do that.
Okay. Zoos claim to be vital players in reducing biodiversity loss, a lot of that through their captive breeding programs. Are they actually helping to save species?
That is something that has been, along with public education or conservation education, that has been
Mhm,
the go-to rationales for zoos in the modern era, even the
mhm,
last half of the modern era.
mhm,
Um, that look, even if you have some discomfort, we're doing these fantastic things for animals.
mhm,
And I would be disingenuous if I said zoos aren't doing anything that's good. With 10 to 12,000 in the world, surely they've got to do some of them have to do some good things,
mhm,
and they do. But I think that when you look at what zoos are still presenting to the public, that they are like Noah's Ark, that they are preserving as an assurance or insurance against species extinction in the future, that they are preserving these populations of animals in captivity, and that this is somehow useful to biodiversity, I think is just fantasy. I don't think there's much evidence that it's going to work. Zoos do not have the capacity, even if you added all the zoos together in the world, there's very little capacity to stem in any meaningful way biodiversity loss. The numbers of animals that have actually been released back into the wild through zoo-driven programs or programs where zoos have played a major role are minimal. And most of those are still heavily managed situations. There's not any unqualified successes where everything's fine now.
mhm,
And there are a whole range of problems associated with captive breeding. Very simply put, the best way to help animals is to keep them in the wild in the first place. And I think that's something that zoos haven't done enough to help with, and that they've used captive breeding as a smokescreen against criticisms that they haven't helped animals in situ in the wild the
mhm,
way they should.
mhm,
Um, Now, having said that, like I said, you got 12,000 zoos in the world. There are some good things that they've done, but I think you don't need the whole global zoo industry to do those good things. You could do it with a lot less. In fact,
okay.
I would say that most of the zoos I've seen, you don't even really need the zoos to do that. If a bunch of people got together and created an NGO to do some of the things that they're doing, you could do them without having the zoo there at all. So I
Okay.
think it's overblown. I think the argument that zoos are Noah's Ark, that in the future they're going to release the progeny of these founder
Mhm.
populations back into the wild, I think that's scientifically, I think it's pretty much nonsense. It's not going
Okay.
to happen.
Okay. I know another big part of what a lot of zoos will talk about they do is donate, a lot of money to conserve areas of wild that have not been wiped out yet. Do you know how much zoos actually spend for that?
Most zoos, nothing,
Okay.
nothing at all. With the AZA zoos, when you're talking about in situ conservation, which would be all aspects of anything to do with conservation in the field, including what you've just mentioned, the numbers I've heard are 3 to 5% of their annual operating budgets, but that's for everything related to that type of conservation. So it's pretty minimal. I don't think zoos are doing a lot. Certainly, there are some individual zoos that are involved in, a hippo preserve here or doing this work. The only exception, sort of big exception to the rule, might be the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York. They run the 5 New York zoos, and they are one of the larger conservation NGOs in the world. They do a lot of that, but they are anomalous in the zoo world. The only other ones I've heard claimed are making a substantial contribution are the San Diego Zoo and Disney's Animal Kingdom. But I think when I look at the numbers, what they're providing, I think it's minuscule.
Mm,
So as far as I can tell,
mm,
in my opinion, so far, the Wildlife Conservation Society seems to be the only one that's working on a bigger level.
mm,
Everybody else, it's a little bit here and there. And
mhm,
ultimately, zoos could be doing a heck of a lot more to help with conservation loss. And I'll just give you one example.
mhm,
Very few zoos in Canada advocate for preservation of wild spaces and all of the issues that come with that. And they should be right there if they're wanting to save wildlife and wanting to save nature. They should be on the forefront of that kind of advocacy, and they're not.
mhm, mhm. I know zoos traditionally and even now are often seen as extremely important for educating people and raising young
Yep.
conservationists. What's your thought about that?
Well, again, it's one of those things that zoos have said for a long time. And I've often referred to conservation and education. And again, I'll always qualify my comments by saying, yeah, there are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, that those two things are the two great modern mythologies of zoos, and they're the ones that they rely on. Those are their go-to arguments. But when you look at zoo education, there's a number of things to think about. And I'll tell you a few of them. I actually made a list of about 30 things you can consider, but we don't have time for that. So I'll just mention a few of them. Number one, modern zoos are based on an 18th century concept, started in 1750 zoo, this menagerie style situation where people come and view animals and they move from one animal to another. And the concept, even though there are all these bells and whistles in zoos now and all these things and these tricks and all the things we've talked
Mhm,
about, the concept is still generally the same. Members of the public with no uh, um, advanced research or anything like that, they just come and they view animals, and it's largely a recreational experience. So you got this old concept. Most visitors, 90% of them are casual visitors. They're families with kids, and they're just there for a nice day out. They're not going to the zoo to learn. The numbers of people that go to the zoo to learn, like in a substantive or meaningful way, are extremely small. And the other 90%, they may learn an orangutan lives in Borneo or something like that, like stuff, factoid type
mhm,
information that you could get in a children's book or 2 minutes on the internet. So 90% are casual visitors. There's actually not a huge body, not even I would think, a meaningful body of research that shows that zoos educate people the way they say. And certainly there's even less research that says that they're changing their behavior, their habits, their lifestyles to benefit the environment. They're not. That's just something zoos say.
mhm,
And then there are other things. When you look at the animal in the zoo, think about what you can learn. You can't learn about uh, you know most aspects of that animal's life. You can't learn about migration. You can't learn about normal social relationships. There's most of that animal's life you can't learn about because that animal is completely and totally out of its natural ecological context. So you may be able to get the size, shape, and color of the animal, but even that, like with Przewalski's horses or polar bears, might be different.
mhm,
I've seen lions and big cats in the wild, and most of the ones I've seen in zoos look nothing like the ones in the wild. So sometimes you don't even see that. So they're out of their natural ecological context, and you can't learn much really about their real lives. And then zoos will often promote facts that are not facts, or as we've heard in the United States, are alternative facts. that, elephants only live 40 years, orcas only live, 25 years, things like that. There's a lot of old information or misinformation that's conveyed to the public, and that can be a problem, and that is obviously counter-educational. Um, there are captive animals, and we've talked about this, the stereotypies, the maladaptive behaviors that animals get that zoos don't explain. They don't say, look, we're doing our best. We're trying to save species. We're encountering these problems. And the reason you're seeing this lion pacing back and forth, that's called a stereotypy. And this is what it means. They're trying to say, oh, they're either glossing over and ignoring it, not telling anybody anything, or I've seen many zoos that try to provide some type of ridiculous alternative explanation. That's counter educational. Just be
Mm-hmm.
honest with people. If you believe in your concept, but it's got problems, then treat people with respect and just tell them what's happening. And if they believe that you're suitably motivated and ultimately this is going to help, well, maybe that sacrifice is worth it. That's when it really bugs me. Casual visitors spend very limited time looking at animals. We did surveys when we were trying to get the Toronto elephants out of the zoo, and the average was between 1 and 90 seconds looking at an animal.
Wow.
Uh, and there were birds where people didn't even stop, where they just glanced over while they were moving and didn't
Right.
even stop.
Yeah.
So I would challenge anyone to prove to me that you can learn anything meaningful in one to
Mm-hmm.
90 seconds. And even the big charismatic animals like the elephants and other creatures, generally people are looking about 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You do get the odd outlier that looks for 2 hours, but generally it's about 5 minutes. What on earth can you learn about animals in 5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that zoos don't really convey to the public that comes to their facilities what's really happening in the world. Like you do not leave a zoo understanding the scale, the ferocity of the attack on wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
You don't come away learning about local issues and how they affect wildlife. You don't come away from zoos understanding the gravity of climate change and why all the deniers who say it's not happening don't know what they're talking. You do not get this real world messaging, and they don't want to alienate their supporters. They don't want people to
Mm-hmm.
want to leave the zoo and want
Mm-hmm.
to slit their wrist because the world's falling apart.
Right.
But I think they have a responsibility because they say they're interested in saving the world and saving wildlife, to be honest, to give people hope, but at the same time tell them why this is such a concern and why they should do whatever they can within the context of their own lives and their own capacities to be a part of the solution rather than the problem. They
Mm-hmm.
don't do that. And to me, it's a squandered opportunity. You have millions of people going through zoos, and I think you could give real world messaging and connect people to real world causes and issues and solutions and all that, and still give them hope.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll finish with just one more, and that is that while zoos, the studies that do exist tend to look at what's the perceived benefit.
Mm-hmm.
They would say it's real in many studies that there's this real benefit. It tends to be very small, a few percentage points here and there, increase in knowledge or whatever. But I would say that what they don't do is they don't look at what is the negative effect. If there's some positive effect with some people, a small percentage, what is the negative effect on people? Does this make them, their perspective more utilitarian? Do they see animals more as commodities? Do they get normalized to the confinement and abuse of animals? Like there are all these areas that are not studied, and I think it would be important for zoos and for their own survival to look at that and to understand that. And I have not seen much in that regard. So I think the whole idea of education, when you look at it, and I've only scratched the surface here on
Mm-hmm.
education, there are huge, huge holes in the argument. I think that there is potential, but zoos would have to change
Mm-hmm.
to be able to say that they're doing this education in a meaningful and productive way that's going to help the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, some people are educated. I think it's a small number. Most people come away with a fact or two, and then they forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, that's sort of what the situation is right now.
Yeah. Okay. We are down to our last couple of minutes, and you have
Okay.
mentioned throughout the conversation, you've mentioned sanctuaries, and you've also mentioned kind of the future of what zoos could be. In less than a minute, would you be able to give an idea of if there were a perfect world, what do you think a future of zoos slash sanctuaries could be?
Yeah, I think sanctuaries are moving in the right direction, especially the ones that are providing spacious environments for their animals. So the elephant sanctuary in Tennessee or the wild animal sanctuary in Colorado, they offer some of the largest spaces for the animals that they keep anywhere in the world outside of the wild. I think they really point the direction that for some animals, if you can't give them adequate space, and I would probably say not some, most animals, if you can't give them adequate space, then you've either got to change your zoo or you've got to not keep them. But what should zoos do in the future? How should they change? I'll give you a bit of a laundry list. Number one, they should put the priority of the animals first, not the public. They shouldn't be spending 70 to 80% of their capital budgets when they're constructing on things that are for human caretakers of animals or for visitors. The animals have to be first. They have to recognize that nature is the norm and not to focus on these big high-tech glossy exhibits. They're all over the world. They are monuments to zoo directors, and they're bad for animals. That nature should be what's replicated to the extent possible, not all these other things. And there you can see legions and legions of new exhibits that are entirely artificial. They look like movie sets. I've seen exhibits that I said it looks more, this African exhibit looks more like the interior of a lobby in a building in Nairobi than it does, the savannah. Let's get away from that. Recognize that nature is the norm. Keep fewer animals. Get away from this ridiculous. We need one of this, one of that, one of everything else. That's an old way of thinking, and it's going to be the downfall of many animals that are in need. Um, there should be more specialization. If you're not engaged in the breeding of conservation dependent species, then keep species that you can keep properly. So if you're many regional zoos do this, they only keep animals that live in that environment, in that climate, and all that, and they can do much better for them. And if you're keeping other kinds of animals for conservation purposes, well, number one, make sure there's a bona fide purpose that these animals have some prospect of their progeny, first or second generation, going back into the wild, and stop breeding all the common animals. That's some of the things. Emphasize the small rather than the large. Every town and city zoo wanted an elephant, a tiger, a hippo, and this. No, most of the world's wildlife is small, but
Mm-hmm.
you would never know that when you leave a zoo.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody would ever understand that, or the importance of all these smaller animals who are suffering too now. We have an insect apocalypse. We have a 30% reduction in songbirds in North America, like massive numbers of these smaller animals that literally are going the way of the dinosaurs. That's not represented in zoos. You get a totally skewed, inaccurate perception of what biodiversity encompasses when you go to the zoo. Just two more points. Greater space for large animals. Get away from this nonsense of large animals don't need large spaces. They
Mm-hmm.
do. So, and that would to me be everything from the size of a squirrel up to a whale.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and and again, get away from the sanitization of the messaging. Let's use the zoo in the future as a way to really educate people and to get them activated. The crises that are out there for wildlife, for the environment, and ultimately for many people too, because there are consequences to what's going on. You see that with wildfires and all these other
Mm-hmm.
things. Um, you know, that's got to be recognized and addressed. And I understand perfectly the constraints within all the different governance models and the way things operate and economic considerations and all that. But zoos should be actively getting away from sanitized messaging, as one reporter said in one of the Toronto papers many years ago, about vague whimperings about endangered species in far off places. Let's get real messages out there. You it is achievable. Sanctuaries, I've been to many of them that do that. There are a few zoos that do that. But a lot's got to change. There's got to be, I think, this change in the zoo paradigm, and it would mean less zoos. It would mean fewer animals, but I think it would be far better for biodiversity, for individual species, for individual animals, and for the environments in which they live, and ultimately too for us. So, hey, zoos, stop squandering the opportunity that you have and change.
Do you think there's one simple thing that anyone listening to this today could do right now to help wildlife in captivity?
Well, I'll give you two simple things. One that relates to sort of the roadside zoos and pseudo sanctuaries and
Mhm.
all that, and all the entertainment associated types of activities. Don't give them your money. Don't go. Do not go to roadside zoos. And I understand sometimes you might not know if it's a roadside zoo or not, but don't go to roadside zoos. Never, ever hire any business with wild animals to come to your home, to come to your school, to come to your business or institution, your event. Don't do that. That is bad for animals. That's something that is spread right across the continent. Thousands of people hire these businesses. And if they move the animals and they bring them to your party or your show or your event, they're abusive. Don't do that. Don't do swim with the dolphins. Don't do photo selfies. Don't do cub petting. Any of those things. Don't walk with wolves. There's all kinds of things in the United States and many of them in Canada too that are in that sort of broad suite of activities. Don't do any of that. The only things you should be doing is viewing animals, whether it's in a credible humane facility or at least one that's professional, or the wild, that you view animals without being intrusive in a respectful, compassionate way. And there are all kinds of opportunities to do that. So stay away from everything else and don't swim with the dolphins. That's a big one too. That's terrible. Uh, so that would be the one for that category. For the other category, it's what I mentioned before. If you choose to visit a zoo, I would say, I would prefer people not go, but I'm not going to say don't go. But I would say if you do go, try to go and do some critical thinking. Do just 20 minutes of research about a couple of the animals you're going to look at, and just see if what you read about them jives with what is happening in the zoo. And understand and keep in the back of your mind that, like we had talked about earlier with dogs, that you're
Mhm.
only seeing a tiny sliver of that animal's existence, and
Mhm.
and understand that that animal could be there for months, weeks, or decades and decades in that space. So try to do that critical thinking, try to do that analysis. If you can, do a little bit of research either before or after going. And then if you're concerned, like I said before, don't keep it to yourself. That's what I would hope people would do.
Okay, how great was that? Isn't Rob just a wealth of knowledge? I hope you're feeling that same kind of sentiment that I'm feeling, that I'm better equipped to go out and have conversations about zoos with the people around me. If you're interested into digging into more of Rob's work or connecting with him, you can do that at his website. It is at zoocheck.com. That's ZOOCHECK.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, I actually think think you would like another conversation that I had with a friend of Rob's named Yulara Nakagawa. She does a ton of work to help elephants who live in captivity in Japan. These are elephants who are in zoos all by themselves. It's episode number 65, and you really get to learn a lot about elephants in that conversation, and then why it's not okay for them to be solitary and what we can do to help. Today's show notes, which include the video of the recording, the audio of the recording, and a blog post and links, and lots of graphics that you can post to social media if you would like. Those are all available at fouranimalsforearth.com/show/78. Please hit subscribe wherever you are listening to this or watching it to help us continue to grow and for you to be notified when more interviews come out. I have a great lineup coming up. There are so many great interviews in the past. If you're new to the show, you can look back and see all of these different topics that we've covered. And I have a great lineup coming that I'm just so excited to share with you guys and get out there. If you want to connect with me personally, you can do that on Instagram at 4animals4earth. You can DM me there. And like I said, if you want to dig into some of the resources that we've provided over the years, you can do that at youtube.com at 4animals4earth, or you can do that on our website at 4animalsforearth.com. All right, thanks guys. I'll be back soon. Bye.